welcome to this business announcement slash Q&A session done in the late afternoon during my summer. Welcome to Varn Blog. And I'm going over some changes to the format of the show, some discussion about things that I think need to be handled as far as the audience goes, to remind people what's available on Patreon, and to take general questions. I'm going to give this a little bit of a second to build, because I know that usually whenever I do one of these live streams, the first 5 minutes, I have like a 20th of the audience. So the introductory monologue actually doesn't really help, which it normally does on a pre-scheduled show. I also know that for whatever reason, being an unmonetized channel, the algorithm is kinder to my live streams than to my pre-scheduled videos, but I don't have time to live stream all the time. One of the things I'm going to announce is I'm promising to do a live stream about once a month to the channel. Most of the stuff I'm doing is taking away stuff. I've gotten complaints, a lot of complaints, tons of complaints actually, about putting out too much material. I am not a monetized show. I say that all the time, but it's very serious. I am monetized only by my Patreon. I don't take ads on the YouTube channel, and I barely take ads on the free podcast feed. For those of you to be reminded, there is a free podcast feed where I put all the interviews up. Steve stands for Christopher. It's my first name. There's also been complaints about me doing long textual reading engagements that break up into like 20 episodes. I think those are good things to do. But I see the problem, so I'm trying to limit the radical engagement to things I can cover in no more than 3 episodes, preferably 1. And if I want to do something longer, I'm going to do a cycle of individual small pieces that are responding to each other and not everything else. I have increased the radical engagement portion of the show for 2 reasons. One, they're relatively easy for me to produce. I do have to do some pre-research, but not nearly as much as when I'm scripting out Nailing It Down, which are the other show that I do that doesn't always have that big of an audience. That Nailing It Down is just taking a concept from any part of critical theory and working it out, or going back into history. The biggest series of Nailing It Down that I did was over a year ago, and that was What We Talk About When We Talk About Class, where I went through the various sociological theories of class and stopped at Werner Sombart, because I realized that once I got beyond the German historical school, there was just way too much to cover, and I should write a book on it or get a degree in sociology. So, yeah. So some changes are, I'm going to be doing usually 3, sometimes 4 shows a week, plus the free show, the free live stream once a month. That means things for patrons is largely unchanged. They get 1 additional show a weekend. I only promise 1 a month, but I tend to do 4 a month. And a Q&A live stream that's just for patrons and people in the Discord, which I do approximately once a month. I didn't get one in July because I had to travel, so there will be 2 coming up in August for patrons. But I will try to do 1 evening Q&A once a month. Radical engagements is going to be continued, but like I said, I only want to do at most 2 of those a week. The Tuesday interviews, the mainstay of the interview show, that's not changing. That's going to remain as it is. That's the hardest thing for me to do, believe it or not, because I have to book, read, and get everything together. So this is something that I do there. I don't often appear on other shows anymore. Because I'm kind of volatile. I liked podcasting on other shows a lot. I have not liked live streaming. I have to deal with other people's audiences, et cetera, et cetera. They're things that I didn't have to deal with when I started this fucking 15 years ago on a lark when I was in South Korea. So that's one change. There's one Boundless and Bottomless a month. I will try to produce supplements to further that when available. So like right now we're doing the Dubin book, the major one, but I've done supplements on other Dubin books and on Duginism generally. Boundless and Bottomless is like a reading club and what we might call right-wing mirror of critical theory, to use a title of a book, are conservative thinkers as opposed to conservative punditry. I'm not interested in responding to low-hanging fruit like Ben Shapiro and shit made for public consumption, because conservatives themselves actually have a kind of hierarchical view of knowledge generally. And what they put out for the public and what they have for themselves are very different. That's part of the nature of their ideology. So it's, you know, I don't see the purpose in like chasing Ben Shapiro, because that stuff is actually made to get people to chase it. I also think one of the dangers of the solo videos is, particularly if I do them too much, is that there's a temptation due to the discourse on the various social medias to get sucked into punditry. And as I've said on Twitter, punditry often leads to only considering the trees and pretending the forest doesn't exist, or that the forest doesn't exist in time. So so that makes that difficult. Would I consider doing it in different podcast feeds? There's not an easy way to do that. Right now I am ordering it by collections, but I know that doesn't generate new RSS feeds. I'm also going to allow people to purchase settled collections for small fees. I think like $7. $5 if you don't use Apple. Apple has a surcharge. So if you don't want to be a regular patron, but you want access to a series that I did that's completed, I will sell that to you for a small fee. If it's like a book series or something like that, where I discussed one book for a long period of time. I'm not willing to sell individual episodes because the minimum I can sell them for is $3, and that's what I charge for monthly access, and I'm not willing to rip you off like that. So yeah. So it will be available. The other podcast feeds, I don't really know how to do behind the paywall. And I'm not willing to make them free. It would defeat the purpose of what I'm doing. But on Patreons, I just don't know how to do that. I don't know how to be like, okay, this collection has got its own RSS feed. I wish I did. And if I figure it out, or if they enable it, I will do that for you. I promise. I just don't want to start managing like 5 different Patreons and parasiting off myself. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So let's talk about the shows that are still going on. I mentioned Boundless and Bottomless. I am bringing back Excavations, but it's not just me and Jordin Dubin anymore. Jordin is very busy with her personal life, and we are still waiting to finish an epic book discussion of Cohost that stopped in October. We did one a couple months ago, but Jordin's been very busy, and I haven't heard from her in a while. I think she's been kind of restarting her life, and I'll leave it at that. So there's no acrimonious split though before people think. I know I'm notoriously hard to work with, but I tend to be pretty nice to my collaborators. It's people who hire me that have to look out for shit. Okay, so Alexandra Brackett asks, could you elaborate what you mean by punditry? Does that mean you won't be commenting on current events as much? I will still be commenting on current events. but I'm not commenting on the way of making predictions. So that's a good question. Pundits make predictions. They actually get rewarded for wrong predictions, right? Like, and getting in on the hot takes on what specifically is going on in the discourse. I am interested in pushing back on that a lot of the time. I mean, it's really easy to do on something like Twitter, but I'm not interested in like trying to talk about how the left should respond to Kamala Harris or what the left should do about this or that specific thing on Trump. Because a lot of times I think people are talking out their asses and they make predictions that are wrong. Recently, I've done a live stream with Jason N of the Regrettable Century on Decadence, and we made some predictions that were wrong within a week of them being made. All right, I'm aware of that. I know it's a danger of punditry, but it's also short-term gains, and short-term thinking is unfortunately endemic in our society right now. I do think we have to have a long durée view and still be able to comment on contemporary political events. So contextualizing those events in terms of history and material analysis is much more important than me trying to pick how the left should tactically or strategically deal with this, that, or the other in regards to contemporary electoral politics and the 4-year cycles that they exist in. I've said many times, even in regards to foreign politics, that people tend to follow things superficially, flare up briefly, and then not follow up the results or consequences of for many, 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 many years. And that's a fundamental mistake. I also record my interview episodes months in advance. Sometimes disturbingly so. You know, there will be times where I will intervene on contemporary politics. For example, I supported the uncommitted campaign in the Democratic Party, even though I thought it was a Hail Mary pass to do anything about the situation in Gaza and wasn't sure that it would work even in the terms of the Democratic Party. It's hard to see if that had any effect on Biden. A lot of people have told me that it did. I think that's hopium. But what are you going to do? So, Excavations is coming back without Jordin Dubin, and we're going to be doing books. I'm doing volume 1, 2, and 3 of The Accursed Share by Bataille. And instead of just doing it with one person, I'm pulling from my audience for people who want to do it like I do book clubs. For those of you who don't know, in the Discord, run about 7 different book clubs. There's 2 different capital fucking reading groups going on. I'm not involved with either one of them. Sorry. I've done so many of those. I never want to do one again. Why The Accursed Share? Because I think it's insightful and also insane. It's one of those books that is split between really incisely picking up on certain trends that were popular at the time, but also take it up into insanity land. And it's actually a cautionary tale. I think most texts are cautionary. I mean, even some of Marxist texts are cautionary. So that's one thing that's changing. You'll get one of those a month because I'm relying on volunteers. I have about 5 people in this current round. I'll be adding. For those of you who also follow Boundless and Bottomless, there will be other people. You know, the panel may expand or change. I think Chris N has committed to all of them. Sean will commit to ones that interest him. Once we get close to the end of Dugan, we're about halfway through this book. And I still might do 1 or 2 more supplements in October or whatever to talk about some other Dugan books that are important. We will be putting up the kind of Kohanas and patrons to vote for us, you know, out of selection of 4 conservative books going up. And I think I might do that with the Excavations too. I'm going to maybe have my audience pick from a set of books that I feel comfortable leading a book discussion on. I am currently behind the Patreon doing and releasing it to the audience, a book series on Eric Olin Wright's Understanding Class, something that I have begun a book series on with the Emancipation Network before Tom O'Brien and I had a falling out, which then later on led to my falling out with Esri XK. For those of you who are XK, XB, I don't know what she calls herself now. For those of you who don't know, I was one of the founding members of the Emancipation Network, which was founded out of the same collapse around the proto-Marxist Center a long time ago now. It's like 2016. That led to the establishment of Cosmonaut magazine, believe it or not. And there was some overlap in the original membership of the groups. Donald and a few other members of Cosmonaut's early editorial staff were actually involved with the reading series over at Emancipation Network. Then we talked about working with them in a prolonged manner. Then Esri and Donald had a falling out, to put it mildly. Now, this is all stupid left-wing, almost high school level drama. I don't want to go too much into it. Someone had the audacity to call me. Weird Solosky asks, what do you think about Catron's idea for a new socialist party? He's been talking about it again. I liked his early initiatives way back in 2016, I believe. I would be afraid right now, given Platypus's general posturing, to give the right more credibility than it gives the left. I mean, in that it takes the right more on face value. It's not to say that they're rightist. I think people misunderstand me when I say that. I don't believe that. It is to say that I think that they just seem to like take certain things said by right-wingers a lot more on face value than they do the left. And I'm not sure we should take any of it at face value. Anyway, I think it would be good to have a socialist party in America. There's arguably already 4 sects that do the same thing, though. And a lot of attempts to build stuff outside of the DSA have also gone in the way of weird sectarian thinking. So I don't know, I'll listen to it again. As far as like, I don't listen to everything that goes on. I don't listen to Sublation Media. I'm just going to admit that I don't follow it. And part of that's for personal reasons. It's not because I dislike Doug Lane personally or dislike Chris Catron personally. That's actually a really big misunderstanding. If I really dislike you personally, I'm not going to mention you. All right. People who I actively hate, I don't platform, even in negative senses. I don't engage with them at all, particularly if it's for personal reasons. So let's just clarify that. But I often just can't be made to care about what kinds of things get brought up in Sublation Media. I just, I like Benjamin Studebaker. He's around there these days. I like Jason Miles enough. He's around there too. Yeah. Doug and Ashley announced a new app to support this. Another app. Go ahead. Great. Lovely. What you need to build a party is not just an ideologically correct pedagogy or whatever. And even Chris Catron admits that. Starting by building a party as the primary thing you do to build a party is actually probably mistaken. Historically, parties come out of the coalitions of other organizations. So, and that's even true in the United States. So building a party in that way, I guess I want to see their plans, because just starting another one is not particularly meaningful. I'm glad that they're clarifying that they want a socialist party and not the tail on some currently existing party, because I'm kind of tired of dealing with that in any direction, whether you're tailing Democrats or Republicans. Even if you think you need to do electoralism to influence already existing major parties, and I'm not saying there's no time or reason to ever do that, it needs to be done from an independent standpoint and not captured to one side or the other. And unfortunately, the left, whatever the fuck that is, itself has a hard time dealing with the fact that independent organizations cannot be just subordinated to whatever faction of whatever party that they want it to be subordinated to. In this case, in America, usually the progressive faction of the Democratic Party, of which the Democratic Socialists and the Dutch Democrats are downstream. I don't see the purpose in that. That seems to be a way to be captured. It's not really helpful. But I also don't see the purpose in trying to tail other forms of politics using their memes and their rhetoric and their nationalism, etc., and often their cultural concerns. Because that usually strikes people as fundamentally dishonest. It's one of those things where neither warm nor cold, so I spit you out, to use the biblical quote. How do you have a new left party in the U.S.? Well, one, you're going to have multiple independent movements to change the state constitutions. There's no way around that. Two, you need a more effective labor movement than you currently have in the U.S. The labor movements of the world are kind of anemic right now, even in Europe, but they are stronger pretty much everywhere outside of the U.S., and then it has to be dealt with. Three, you need agreements that are based on problematic, not sectarian understandings. Unifying off of a need for concrete ideology or concrete loyalty to a specific leadership is usually a bad method of building a political movement. Demagogic political movements become popular when broader institutional politics is falling apart and collaborationism is made more immediately a need to maintain usually the capitalist or sometimes pre-capitalist states. Mass lines. I don't use that because mass line is inherently class collaborationist. Do we need parties? Why not coalitions on particular issues? Avoid groupthink, capture authoritarianism. I think you do eventually need parties as a manifestation of political movements, but do you need them right now? That's a different question. There is nothing inherently authoritarian about a party. The model of parties based off of the Prussian Central Command that was adopted by Lenin because they were in the midst of a civil war from 1918 to 1921 is not something you should eternally take as the model of party. I think parties have to have factions. I think parties have to have regional development. I think parties have to have coalitions outside of the party that can hold them accountable. All this stuff about like electeds from the DSA is a waste of time when you don't have a program to hold the electeds accountable to, voters to punish them, and trust me, 50K or 100K, it's probably closer to 50 now, of low investment paper members does not lead to the ability, particularly when those members are in key Democratic strongholds anyway, like New York and California, to punish elected Dems, particularly when you're a national organization without regional coordination and your locals are very tiny compared to the local population, even in New York. And New York is a place where the DSA has been a political caucus in the Democratic Party somewhat successfully, but all the way back into the 1980s. I can talk about the problems with that and the structural problems that leads to today, and why I don't think the DSA is probably the most likely candidate for a new socialist party to emerge, but it is possible for it to emerge from that, just like it was possible for it to emerge from the SDS in the 1970s, which is the closest DSA analog. But we have watched the DSA even paper membership decline probably from about 8,500. They've talked about almost 100K for forever, but probably from about 85,000, 100, to about 50 something K from the last internal report that I was given. So they're on a pretty steep decline node. And they have very different factions within them, and there's no regional coordination that is not factional and thus ideological. There are factions in DSA that I like. I kind of like Marxist Unity Group. I'm not opposed to the Communist Caucus. I'm not opposed to the very tiny Winters Caucus. I like parts of Bread and Roses sometimes. I'm not so much into the self-liquidating Trotskyist organizations that became caucuses that have kind of become marginalized. And I just don't know enough about where to start to say one thing or the other, even though they're in the NPC. But the caucus formations are unstable. They substitute as a Klug fix to the fact there isn't regional coordination, and it doesn't deal with the structural constitutional problems of the DSA, which I don't see being fixed anytime soon, because part of the problems with the DSA are related to their very structure, which allowed them to grow so fast. When you are a clearinghouse of prior sectarian socialists into a effective advocacy organization that also has ties to NGOs and the New York housing market and blah, 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 it becomes very clear that if you actually developed a program, it would split the organization almost immediately and also put it even more at odds with the Democratic electeds. But these people didn't build the organizations to hold the Democratic electeds accountable in the first place outside of the DSA, and the DSA is not big enough or rich enough to do it. Whew. So I'm actually talking with I have a couple of series you might notice. I do try to get interesting interlocutors on the interview channel, but I also have people that I'm comfortable talking with, like Nico Villarreal, Elijah Emery, who represents something like a closer left Democrat than I do. It's like my ability to talk with somebody who comes from a politics that's not as alien to a lot of people as mine are. Sean KB from Antifada, the Brothers Regrettable, Chris and Jason from Regrettable Century. But you'll see an expansion of that pool in the next couple of months. I'm also still trying to get new people on the show, and I've had some success, and I had to get back on Twitter to do it, frankly. Academics don't answer their email anymore for a variety of reasons, but they'll respond to you on Twitter or X, whatever the fuck you want to call it. So yeah. Is entryism to the CPUSA for the sake of one big party feudal and doomed? Well, the CPUSA has structures that go all the way back to the Cold War that it's not willing to remove. This has led to several, and not just the most obvious, frustrations and attempts to split in the last few months. The ACP, the American Communist Party, debacle is one of many. I do know that Stefan Hamill has advocated that we all enter the CPUSA to change its ranks. I don't think its voting structure would allow that. I think also its use of the post-1921 Bolshevik Constitution was actually a fundamental problem for democratic deliverance, and it's designed to protect bureaucracy. That's what it's designed to do, which was understandable in a Civil War footing. It's not understandable for us today. I don't see Mug splitting from the DSA. I don't see it either. But if Mug achieved what they wanted to do, the DSA would split, I think. If they actually got their programmatic Marxism, it would require, even if they don't adopt something like the 21 points on the 1918 Bolshevik Constitution, and given Donald Parkinson's love of Lenin, I don't see them not having something like that. It would probably require like Socialist Majority Caucus and those kind of groups to split. So, yeah. So as far as the show is going, which is why I did this, look for less shows a week. I'm sorry, I just don't. I'm writing a book, and I'm posting too much, and I was really going crazy on the Patreon end. There was this time where I was doing like 3 articles at a time. Yeah, Alexandra says Socialist Majority Caucus and Groundwork would actively try to destroy the organization if MUG implemented its program. I think that's true. I don't think there's a way around that. And I also think either side trying to kick the other out would be a breach of their democratic credentials. So it's it is kind of an impasse. It would lead to a split. I don't really know how it could not happen. So, yeah. So anyway, Radical Engagement's dropping back. They'll be on. I argued about whether I should release them Monday and Wednesday or Monday and Friday, but occasionally go on other shows and co-stream them here on Wednesdays and Thursdays. So we're going to just put them on Monday and Friday. Or solo when I feel so inclined. My solos do better than the Radical Engagements. Unfortunately, I think they're more ephemeral. Some of my solos are too specific to a given time period. And I kind of like the idea that I'm creating an educational corpus that's available for people who are willing to use YouTube for free, or for people who want an RSS feed and more personal engagement for very low amount. And it's important to me that I'm not just doing the commentary on immediate politics. There's enough fucking shows that do that, guys. Just like there's enough Theory 101 shows. If you want people to walk you in baby steps through, State and Revolution or something by Foucault or whatever, there's already 50 fucking shows that do that. I'm not interested in that for a variety of reasons. Not because I'm some elitist who thinks that you don't need introductory material. In fact, teaching introductory material over and over again is how you get good at teaching introductory material is really important. I just think right now there's not a whole lot of intermediate and deep material that's available for free. There are exceptions. They're sectarian, but they're good. I think there's some deep dives that go on over in Cosmonaut Land. I think there's some deep dives going over at The Measures Taken and sometimes Regrettable Century. But I don't want to be a pundit. I hate it. I also think it leads to bad thinking. I've seen a lot of people who were good Marxists go down weird-ass rabbit holes, not because of eclecticism, but because of an immediacy and a short-termism and a need to constantly grow their audience. I just want to tell you, I'm actually not that interested in being a huge podcast. I have a day job. I am run ragged as it is. And my day job responsibilities are increasing, not decreasing. I am trying to write a book. I'm trying to write 2 books, plus my poetry, which I haven't marketed in 2 years because I've been doing all this shit. One book called Barbarians, which is on concepts of the left, where I'm going to take both a theoretical and memoir approach and talk about what I saw in the millennial left, to use a term from Chris Catrone that really isn't Chris's, it's just a generation demarcator. I think Chris's book on the topic is actually not bad, although it's inevitable that Chris would say that the millennial left was dead because all lefts have been dead. For him, everything has been dead. It's like the key point of Platypus's rhetoric from 2007 forward. But in my understandings of the situation, sorry, I'm live and it's the daytime and I forgot to pause my phone. All right. My understandings of the situations are a little bit different from Chris's. Although I often agree with Chris about the problems of the left, I don't agree with his answers to them in so much that I can even figure out what they are. And I'm not a stupid man, and I've been in platypus affiliated society. So I'm often trying to figure out what concretely Chris wants in regards to the Socialist Party. I'm going to listen to the sublation things, even though, like I said, I don't really follow sublation very closely. They hear more about it, I suppose. Yeah. Well, I wrote an article. Someone saying Chris, the guy with the cart yelling, "Bring out your dead." I wrote an article called "Bringing Out Your Dead" that compared Chris Coturn to Gilles Duvet, the kind of post-Bourdieuist proto-communizationer that was the one side, part of one side, the trampoline side of In Notes Volume 1. If you're in the ultra-left Obscuriana, that's one of them. And I'm going to cover when insurrections die. And I'm increasingly, and JM's actually, JM Cologne's in the audience, and he's my editor on an article I'm writing on Bordiga that may or may not be part of the book. I'm not sure it's actually going to fit. That's going to go into all that. I actually like Spencer Leonard a lot, even personally. I don't, even though I was a member of Platypus, Chris and I have never met in person. He's actually, ironically, one of the great things is I've never made it to a platypus convention ever. Nor, since I left the organization, have I been invited. I'm sure they'd let me show up, but, you know, it is what it is. I have strong disagreements with them on Middle Eastern policy, and I don't think that can be downplayed, and I don't think it can be forgotten. Varn, am I good at math? Depends on the math. I am limited by the fact that I was taught math algorithmically. I am also pretty good at geometric thinking. And I have some grasp of numbers theory. But am I doing calculus 2 in my spare time? No, I'm not. What are my disagreements with what? That's a vague question. All right. You mean on Gaza? A lot of it has to do with the idea that Palestinians are not a bourgeois subject because of their religiosity, which I find kind of questionable. Not kind of questionable, very questionable. And this leads them to take a more Zionist-friendly approach, which is not to say that they endorse Zionism, but it's hard to get Chris to. Chris is very careful that while he comments on contemporary politics in a way that makes it sound like you support it, when you actually ask him or try to pin him down, like he doesn't support Trump. And I believe that, but you wouldn't know that from half his rhetoric. These are these provocation statements he uses as a pedagogical intervention tool. It makes it very hard to understand him. But a lot of his members don't seem to understand him because some of them just become like Claremont Institute people. I'm not naming names, but I know it's happened. So, we have to ask if that's an effective pedagogical strategy after a while. But when Chris comments on contemporary politics, I tend to think he's writing critiques of the left to some degree, but he seems to believe in a separation from bourgeois society from capitalism that I don't find in Marx. Marx doesn't use the term capitalism hardly ever at all. It's really clear when you read it in German. He usually talks about civil society or bourgeois society, and by that they mean capitalist society or things outside of the capitalist state, the reproduction, social material, the mode of production and reproduction, which in capital is viewed rightly or wrongly. And I do agree with Chris that this is actually a point of freedom, not a point of departure, as separate from each other. That's an illusion, but it's kind of a real illusion. I don't know how else to talk about it. In that there is a sense in which the political actually is still affecting the economic in a primary way, because relations of production are partly political, and relations of production are part of the quote mode of production, even using like traditional Marxist language. So you can't pretend that the political is totally in the superstructure, although most of it would be. It's a weird metaphor anyway, and it is a metaphor. It's a model. People insisting on it having some like literal substance are actually accidentally, without realizing it, committing a reification fallacy themselves. And by that, they are hypostaticizing something that is just a metaphor or a model, and all models are to some degree metaphorical. If it wasn't metaphorical, you just have the thing in front of you. This is not a model of a microphone. It's a microphone. So, yeah. Bourgeois society seems important to him because he wants to argue, and I think he is somewhat rightly, that the values of freedom and German idealism, for good or ill, were the concerns of Marxist critique and the emergence of the socialist movement. And I think Catrone is actually right about that. I think they finished the bourgeois revolution in a more literal sense in many cases, particularly in Germany, where they literally hadn't had a bourgeois revolution yet. But nonetheless. A lot of you also are really influenced by truisms, things that are true because they're vague. I mean, like a lot of stuff, like for example, and this will come up on my critiques of Chris on Lukács, where I agree with the broad overview of what Chris is saying. I don't agree with this distinction between bourgeoisie and capitalism, or that capitalism only emerges with the Industrial Revolution. I don't even think that's implied in Das Kapital. Didn't he say something like Palestinian workers should organize with Israeli workers and not kill them? They can't, though. Palestinian workers have been systemically shut out of Palestinian, out of Israeli politics by active choice. Like those kinds of statements actually belie that you don't know much about Israeli society or Israeli political choices. Which, frankly, from what Chris and Doug say, they don't know fucking shit, and they definitely don't read Hebrew. Bourgeoisie and necessarily include petite bourgeoisie. Petite bourgeoisie are, by definition, part of the bourgeoisie. That's not hard to get. Anyway. I mean, like, when part of Israel's strategy is to bring in workers from Southeast Asia, and part of the major way to actually hurt the Israeli war effort is for those workers in Southeast Asia not to come, as was the Indian trade unions actually did do, then it is actually something to point out that Palestinian workers can't unite and build bridges with Israeli workers. Policies of segregation and of curtailment, where you prevent even working benefits and building modes of production together, mean that you basically are wanting to make a population so totally excluded that they are expendable, if not expended. And I think anyone who's studied trying to shut out groups of nation building, that the biggest threat to national coherence is often groups that have to work together who are not of the same ethnicity. which is why you generally prevent them from having full employment. A logic picked up both in Europe and in the southeastern United States. Yeah, Mark's being good on the Irish and the Polish questions is kind of funny because people will use those things to make Mark sound like he means something he doesn't, like on immigration. They will deliberately, selectively cut off the quotes. Marx will say that, yes, immigration does put pressure on individual countries' proletarian and is a real concern, but that that's actually a concern that in the long run is progressive. That's what he says in the Irish and Polish questions over and over again. And someone like Angela Nagel took those quotes out of context to argue that Marx was like pro border control, and the Soviet Union was, because it was a siege state. It might have been a necessary siege state. I'm not arguing about the morality of the situation it was put in. I'm just saying, you can't derive practices from that. Now, someone's asking me off improved private messages, do I think Gazans are integrated in large bourgeois culture? And I would say no, they're not. Most of what's available to Gazans is petit bourgeois at best, if that. And a lot of them are totally lumpenized by no choice of their own, or even by falling into subordinated classes. They are legally prevented from work and legally prevented from easily leaving the enclosed area, as I used to sit with people in the Egyptian airport who were trying to get back into Gaza to see their family and be stuck there for months. So, no, I don't think that there's a big bourgeoisie, but there's the idea that there's no bourgeoisie and there wasn't a nascent petit bourgeois cultural development in Palestine before Israel just seems to me weird. There was bourgeoisifications going on throughout the Ottoman Empire, of which Palestine was most definitely part of. So I don't know really what like this idea also that petit bourgeois or bourgeois people aren't religious, they're highly secular. That's not, there's not a lot of evidence for that, except in fairly developed capitalism, where those religious bonds are actually a threat to capital development. It's the same reason why, like, DEI and stuff emerges. Like, yes, there's all kinds of DEI cultish practices that are utterly grifting bullshit. See Robin DiAngelo and apparently Abraham F. Kendi. But there are pressures that come from the removal of union protections that do call for these kinds of protections to be instituted by the bourgeoisie themselves, because the legal instability being instituted by other elements of the bourgeoisie endanger the workforce. And this is inter-bourgeois competition. And I think socialists don't understand how fractured and fragmented the bourgeoisie is against itself, just because it can occasionally develop more coherent political programs and it can maintain capital and maintain property ultimately. And I think that, that's its own thing. Now, when it talks about like integration into bourgeois subjectivity, that's a different matter. Do petit bourgeois people have bourgeois subjectivity? Yeah. I mean, and there's some ways in which petit bourgeois people are going to fall into either sympathetic to the proletariat or the most reactionary force in fucking society, because their options are kind of bad. Taxes do really hurt them more than they hurt other groups. Their profit margins are low. Their ability to make profits are based on high, unquote, variable capital, to use a Marxist phraseology, aka highly exploiting family and or close labor, or are getting around and skirting labor laws that they're exempted from due to their size. Whereas large bourgeoisie they're not affected by that. They have the the accumulation to deal with taxes, and they benefit from many of the regulatory programs and just its predictability. Depending on the industry, and different industries have different effects here, just like different industries have different immediate effects on short-term working gains. There's a reason why we talk about trade union consciousness so much in Marxism. I mean, look, I fucking love to have trade union consciousness in the United States. Don't get me wrong, but the reason why we talk about it is that it's about immediate gains, and those are sectoral. So, like, gains for one industry will hurt the other. And you actually see this in, like, which industry support what parts of the administrative state at any given time, right? So, So this is kind of an issue you have to deal with. Now, for those of you thinking I'm saying DI is a good thing and it's shutting, I mean, it can't shut down a decade ago. It barely existed a decade ago. Its expansion was really from 2020 to 2022. And it was expanded so idiotically and with a really problematic form of critical race theory undergirding it. And I think CRT is hard to mention now. It's one of these words that's been corrupted by political usage. But CRT's view that racial organization was the primary separation of society, and that you have to view everything through it, also meant that you advocated for policies that would ameliorate racial tensions, but not in terms of race, but economics, etc. Would itself be racist policies because they weren't about ending racism. They also flatten out the distinction between systemic, structural, and implicit bias and bigotry. Systemic and structural may be the same thing. I'm not entirely sure they are. Systemic and structural racism, I mean, which is often about accumulation over time, comparative advantage from the accumulation. But that's not evenly divided amongst white people, like at all. The fact that at one point almost all the American bourgeoisie was white, both is a very different point than saying that all white people benefit from that, even though there are social structural benefits that accrue to all white people because of it, right? I think CRT, particularly of the Abraham X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo variety, one, focused on the feelings of white people in a way that I don't understand. It seems like disempowering to everyone. And two, but is, structurally useful for shutting down debates. But two, it led to an overcorrection that just pretended that some of this racial animosity and stuff didn't exist, or it could be said to just be a function of class oppression, which is just not the case. Those legal codes wouldn't exist, Jim Crow, etc. If it was, nor would the surplus population be disproportionately of certain races. And the reason why I call it the surplus population is because it's clear that mass incarceration and deindustrialization are directly linked. And who did it affect? Vulnerable members of the lower strata of the working class, many of whom were lumpenized once their jobs were relieved, and then the support jobs, and I think Gabriel Winant's actually quite good on this, became low-end professional jobs that we often call PMC. I think it's interesting that so much of PMC is female coded. I do think that's an interesting thing to think about when we talk about PMC. Like elite PMC are not female coded, but a lot of the intermediate PMC stuff is. I don't believe in PMC as a class category because there's no clear relationship to production or income or even education level that defines it. Most people seem to mean has a degree, probably is white collar. Which, in the United States is like 40% of the population. It's definitely double and more than the industrial working class. And if you exempt logistic workers from the industrial working class, it's even worse. You start taking out truckers and stuff who are non-productive. Now, Marx has talked about productivity are not about social productivity. That's a misunderstanding. They're about productivity to capital surplus. And Marx actually didn't think proletarianism, from what I can tell. Now, he doesn't ever define proletarian explicitly, interestingly. We only have it from analogy to the ancient Roman class, which is propertyless. 40% of American workers have some kind of higher education. Only about 25% have bachelor's degrees. That's a 5-fold increase, though, from the 1950s, when about 5% had bachelor's degrees. And 60% of the population under 40 has entered college, period, for something, some kind of certification or something. So this idea that you're only talking about a small portion of the general population is just bullshit. It's wrong. The statistics don't back it up. And the people who use these terminologies do this on purpose. It doesn't break down according to income. Either credentialing is not actually highly predictive of immediate income. It is predictive of lifelong income. And most of the good jobs are credentialed. But having the credential does not necessarily get you the good jobs. And when people talk about the PMC, they basically mean college educated. So, yeah. So, yeah, I think we have to look at that. I also think this attempt to bracket out the service workers because they're non-productive, even though some of them, like people at fast food chains, they're literally giving you a physical commodity that is traded in aggregate on the market. I don't know how they're not they're not just providing a service, which is also tradable on the market as a commodity, by the way. Otherwise, you couldn't trade it on the stock market. But the commodification of services is something that even goes back to like English common law. And it has to do with agrarian labor. This is actually one of the distinctions that I have with Chris Cutrone, if you're interested. Cutrone thinks the ability to accumulate capital starts with machines as capital, the Industrial Revolution, which is a logical deduction. But selling off futures and reinvesting into futures off of speculation from land and being able to sell land titles made it capital before the Industrial Revolution. And unlike the Spanish example or the Italian example of the transition out of feudalism, which I admit that there are a lot of problems with that category. It's not one thing, but that you had this incentive for the first time to invest in productivity, not in extraction. So, for example, New Spain invested tons of stuff in military weaponry. Now, the English did too. We're not going to pretend the English weren't developing stuff in the military, because controlling the sea trades was their whole primary fucking goal against the Spanish. But they had reinvestment schemes that just didn't develop in New Spain. All right. And they developed before the Industrial Revolution, probably creating the incentives for the Industrial Revolution to happen. Right? Which is why I think you can't just say capitalism, bourgeois society comes to a crisis because capitalism emerges with the Industrial Revolution. Marx doesn't say that. Those are not terms that Marx uses at all. I guess you can deduce it as a reading of Marx. But it also doesn't stand to reason given the description of commodity production, which admittedly is trans-historicized in Marx in a problematic way. I mean, Marx talks about these commodities as if they're always, developing, because he's taking that from the works of Locke and Smith, who are naturalizing this. And you can see that there's a real shift there, but it's a long shift, and it's not because of just the machines. So, yeah. financial capital versus machine capital is actually versus land-based capital is actually a much more hairy thing when you start talking about the legal ability to sell land so that you can sell rents based off of future rent incomes. And that develops before the Industrial Revolution. That develops before the Joint Stock Company. You see that beginning to develop in early holdings in England and I think in France. I feel less certain on French history. I've been studying the French medieval state and also the Norman state, which actually had influence from all this Arabic state building and from Sicily that was bringing over into its manor in Normandy and brought over into England, which centralized the state much easier than they did in France and blah, 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 blah. The works of Rodney Hilton and a friend of the show, Adnan Hussein, and stuff like that will help you see that. Anyway, this actually is a substantive point. Yep. The silver exchange and the silver ending up in the East is an interesting problem, and I think that's something I'm still studying. I'm trying to get a better grasp on. So yeah. Anyway, these are far beyond the purview of my show. This is the kind of stuff that I'm talking about with doing analysis versus punditry, because understanding the longue durée of something over an 800-year period really does better equip you for understanding what you need to do now to change things. Right? The purpose isn't just to understand the past, it's to understand the past well enough to start being able to seize the reins of the situation with political interventions. And, those would necessarily be revolutionary, blah, 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 blah. And by revolutionary, I don't just mean insurrectionary, although the two are inherently linked. You really do have to change deep relations of production and social reproduction and the nature of elements of the state or of governments, if you don't think all state is governance, to really handle this, right? So this is why it's important. This is why I get tired of trying to tell you what to do on the strategy about how you should align to the Harris campaign, because my big concern about socialists right now is that most socialists are not different from the rest of society. They're not. You're not specially fucked up. You're just the same fucked up as everyone else. And right now, that's a problem. Right? Right now, that is a limitation. You are a minority ideological orientation, even though the popularity of socialism has increased, with mixed backers from various diverse backgrounds. There's not clear class consciousness coalition around it. And I'm not even dealing with the broad idea of the left here. Okay, I'm just talking about socialism, socialist forms of freedom, etc. That is inherently self-contradictory. I think that is absolutely true, that socialism actually has contradictory demands, and Marx actually points out some of these contradictory demands. There's no way to be compensated fairly under capitalism that doesn't reproduce inequalities. Right? So a fair day's work for a fair wage is that fairness exists now. Socialism seems to be on the decline amongst Gen Z. Gen Z is a highly depoliticized thing, but it's reacting against a lot of the failures of millennials. Millennials talked a lot about socialism in the last 5 to 10 years, just like Gen Xers talk a lot about anarchism. So there's usually a reaction to the last ideological fad. Nobody is paid what they're worth under capitalism. Well, that's an abstract question. Yet they are paid. They are paid what they will accept. So that's fair. what they're worth. If people got paid what they're worth, you have no social surplus. I mean, I basically agree with you, Sam. If people are paid what they actually earn, the whole thing falls apart. That's true under socialism too, though. Marx is not promising that people are going to get all the money that they put, all the time they put in the system back in money, because we have to provision for those who can't work. We have to provision for reinvestment. We have to provision for shortening the work hours, etc. Like, all these sacrifices have to be for something. And if we're not asking for sacrifices, we're bullshitting people. I mean, that's another thing. If people promise you the world and ask you to give up nothing, nah. Is there a video about your disagreements with Colin Drum via Marxism, or have you openly talked about it at all? Because you seem to be otherwise agreeing on a lot of stuff. I think Colin is too harsh on Marxism, and I don't go in it because I've known Colin since he was a Marxist. He's right about a lot of the problems are unquestioned assumptions that are transferred from German idealism. I think he discounts too much some of the good parts of that tradition. But he's not wrong about the bad parts. I also think Colin is somewhat correct that Marx over-focused on commodity money, which historically is actually kind of a rare form of money. But and Colin's also right about the MMTers who overcorrect in the opposite direction, who basically pretend that commodity money doesn't exist. That's not true for all of them. I know Sam Kimberluzu in the comments is going to say something about that. But the way some of them talk about it, you wouldn't know that. So this is sometimes when I talk about my disagreements with MMT, it's often not on their scientific description of the way currency works. It's on when currency schemas are viable and when they're not. So, for example, I don't think, like some MMTers do, that small states can easily do this. Not without forming coalitions of states, but there are political blockages to do that I don't see as dealt with, because they're kind of outside of the purview of a scientific description. You get into the sociology and probabilistic nature of class responses and political contestations, and it's very hard to be scientific about it because it's so complicated that it's hard to reduce to a simple enough variable to analyze simply. Worrying about MAGA communism is histrionic. I'm not that worried about MAGA communism, honestly. Catron, you're late. That was mentioned a half hour ago. I mean, I know exactly who you're talking about. I'm just not naming names for their anonymity. But I'll believe you that there's only one member. Unfortunately, that one member tried to recruit somebody. So, that's why I know about it. Now, I'm not here to make this the Catron Zone. He's got his own show for that. And he's more welcome to come on mine when we're done with this series. I think I'll probably ask Catron on in October. Oh, Chris, remember I was in the organization when you wrote that. And I opposed its leaking for the exact reason you're talking about. Not because I thought that we should be hiding what Platypus says. In fact, I think people would be like, oh, Platypus is trying to fight with the left. Did you read the mission statement? The reason why I opposed it is it was because it was quotes mineable, not because I thought you were hiding anything. I disagree with you on other implications, and I've talked about that, but that's not really I don't think it means that you thought that the Palestinians should be removed from existence or anything like that. Anyway, this is about to become the Catron Hour, and I don't want it to become that because I've devoted a lot to my former teacher. Newbie question. All right. If Gen Z is depoliticized with a more easily accessed higher level Marxist education and works towards reducing factions and different leftist sects help resolve the issue, here's the issue with reducing factions and different less of sex. Why do they exist? Right. If your disagreements are purely ideological, and if your work is purely ideological, there's no way that you're not going to have ideological splits. Now, there are some organizations that can handle those ideological splits and keep people relatively together. The right does this all the time. The Democratic Coalition does this all the time. Fuck, the Bolsheviks did it. I know they didn't do it formally because of the conditions of the Civil War, but they did it. All right. Formal faction bans, however, lead to the domination of one section. I just was teaching Marx Engels reader page, which explicates the difference between bourgeois society of individual production, capitalism, post-collectivized capital. All right. From chapter 32 of volume 1. All right. One of the more interesting things about my dialogue with Chris is I'm getting him to cite stuff. He doesn't sign his articles. So we can discuss it. And to be fair, Chris's articles are normally pithy polemics, often delivered at first verbally, which are aimed at getting people to engage with text. Chris does not think that his articles can substitute with the engagement with the historical tradition. So people who approach him like that, and I'm talking like he's not listening right now, but people who approach him like that are just fundamentally wrong about what he's trying to do. I don't know that this is always, I don't know that his public persona is always an effective way of doing pedagogy, but the shock treatment response to a lot of left shibboleths, I mean, I get it. I mean, there's a ton of fucking left shibboleths that are gross. The biggest one right now, I mean, for me, is trying to get people to think about what it would take to build an independent political movement in the United States. And that's a larger question than, I mean, because there's all kinds of, there's structural hampers, and Varn, he's caught up now. There's structural hampers and this and the other to that. I mean, when I see structural hampers, that's a terrible way of phrasing it. The informal nature of norms around the U.S. government, which actually, however, are somewhat, I think, kind of tyrannous in some ways, and often not very old, prevents people from dealing with the fact that the congressional structure of the United States has limitations. Now, there are ways to fix those limitations, but few socialist organizations seem to be willing to do the kind of federal work to do that. They want to go rush to big metropoles and start there. And I mean, there is a lot of workers there, but you just have to realize the structural limitations of that in a federated state. And if you don't realize that, you'll never do anything about it. Gatron is responding to Palestine stuff, which is just inaccurate. All right, what's your position? Did you disagree with what you were characterized as saying? Because I didn't characterize you that. I was a listener. I just thought that statement's dumb. The state is tyrannical. Taxation is fast. Am I being detained? Yeah. All right. Just get a better strategy, whatever that would be. One thing I'm going to tell you is whatever happens in this next round of elections, I don't think socialists are going to benefit from either one of it. Should socialists vocally oppose income tax? Progressive income tax was part of the Communist Manifesto. However, there were times in which Marx opposed it. Those kind of questions are not. I mean, if you just look at like various programs that were written with Marx, whether it's the French Left Party program or the Communist Manifesto, Marxist relationship to specifics like taxes tend to be tactical. But obviously, like if you have a socialist society, income taxation makes no sense. Why would you need it? If you're in a transitional state, then that's where we can talk about it more meaningfully. I mean, Ben Burgess and I have disagreed on that, but I if you're in a dictatorship of the proletariat, social production would indicate you wouldn't need income taxes. If you're just in a transitional worker state, that's a different question. You probably do need them, because you probably haven't abolished value production, and why would you have? I go back and forth on what I think that would look like. I tend to think that Marx is not talking about wage relations and say critique of the growth of program, that he's talking about you fundamentally don't need them now. Well, I mean, depending on the size of your state, Sam, I think that's different. But in the United States, no, it is true that taxes don't actually pay for much of anything. They do at the state level, and I think that confuses people because states don't have currency sovereignty. But so this is kind of an issue. In the United States, constitutionally speaking, most social services are state level issues, while like the federal government is basically an insurance program that can kill people. So federal spending is not constrained by the need for taxation, but state spending is. And you will notice that even federal spending programs are tied to state spending, I think on purpose, to limit their ability to expand. So how do you think the best advocate for internal democracy within democratic centralist organizations, and what policies do you think would work? What form of democratic centralism are you looking at? I mean, are you talking about the CPUSA? In which case, good luck. I think a lot of those legacy organizations have no incentive to be responsive to democracy, because they also have large numbers of legacy property holdings, which enrich them, and they don't really need membership to do that. Is pointing to the tax burden, even if military funding isn't through taxes, good anti-imperialist messaging, Joe? That's a good question. I'm not sure that it is. I mean, part of the problem that you have is that while the U.S. is the second most productive industrial society on the planet, despite what you hear, it doesn't, like, the process isn't begun and completed here. Like, the supply chain and the production chain is international. And Bass doesn't recruit primarily, does so by the by. We have a conversation about various left tendencies on various topics. Yeah. I will say this: Platypus is not a cadre collection organization. One thing you could ask yourself about taxation, though, I mean, is you have to ask yourself about like some of the social goods that socialists want would empower an administrative state run by capitalists that they don't want. That's a primary contradiction, right? Like if you want a welfare state to empower workers, but you want to administrate it by capitalists and some collaborationist mentality, which you see with someone like Sohrab Ahmari has a collaborationist mentality, you know, almost a distributist social democrat or something. I don't know. If national politics fails, wouldn't that talk about? Anyway, but the problem with the collaborationist mentality is there's no way in current society for those tensions not to come up. Like people don't like being exploited. If national politics fails, what about focusing on local politics as well as entirely? How are you going to build an international politics only focusing on local issues? I mean, it seems like you go back and forth wildly on the left between naive localism and naive national electoralism without looking at regional coalitions, international coalitions, development of programs, multiple tendencies, multiple organizations which can coalesce together to build a political party, which have the ability to hold people accountable beyond the political party itself. If you're all internal to the political party, your political party is not accountable to anyone. You can't control the bureaucrats that way. So oscillating back and forth wildly between the local and the national, which seems to be the predominant trend post 1950, indicates that there's something much larger that is preventing us at looking at and dealing with and building the necessary institutions that one would need to build. We can say neoliberalism, we can say capitalism, but we need to be more specific. The more specific we can get about the current, not the future. Like we're not doing blueprints for the future here. The more specific you can get about the current, the better you're going to be. Right, this is what getting lost in these sectarian battles. Not that these sectarian battles aren't important. One of the things that I admired about Platypus, and in some ways still do, is that they would get tendencies that would normally not talk to each other to talk to each other. And you could learn from that intersection, right? You could develop from that intersection. They aren't the only people who do it. But the problem that you have is even groups that are, let's take a Confident Marxist Unity group, for example. They're not democratic centralists, and they encourage a lot of internal debate, but they let that get super nasty without realizing the effects that that's going to have on the ability to reconcile later. And that's something you do have to consider. Like, how are you going to reincorporate these people in your political movement once you've alienated them on an ideological issue? And that's like, you can't build a viable mass politics without that. Okay, how is Las Vegas didn't inform ideas about hospitality and it not being able to be automated? Well, it's not able to be automated. Parts of it are able to be automated. That's a good question. The one thing I will say is part of the reason why the hospitality industry is getting so expensive is it's labor intensive. There's very little and labor intensity there is because there's very little reason for it can't reduce socially necessary labor time in the same way. And when it can, it does. And that's leading to try to stabilize everything by turning to rent models for this stuff. And I think it's something that you have to think about. Need a third way between Minnesota and Nice and an Irish bar fight. Look, I am, one critique that was made of me all the way back in my platypus days, which is true, is I am interpersonally pretty volatile. I'm quick to forgive because I'm also quick to throw the glove down. I do think it is important to remember that, and I'm going to sound Machiavellian here, but enemies who are materially or ideologically aligned, who come to a consensus together about their immediate needs, are often more loyal to each other than friends are. And there are good reasons for this. This is why I think a lot of faction bans and slate politics and this kind of other stuff is just a waste of time and actually builds bad political instincts. I mean, if you can't see that in the various socialist organizations that have existed post 1950, I don't know what else to show you. And it literally leads to them killing each other in some cases. So it's not something that you really want. I mean, historically, who's the most likely person to kill a communist? Probably another communist. And I know that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but it's kind of statistically true. But how will we even be leftism if our greatest mortal enemies aren't other leftists who only agree 97.87%? Look, the problem with an ideological politics is that a certain degree ideological politics is needed. But I'm going to agree with Chris Catrone on something here. Critique is not the same thing as propaganda. And if you conflate the two, you've kind of failed. Critique also doesn't necessarily know where the answer is going to ultimately lead you. If you are asking a question that you think you have the answer to, then you should probably just state the fucking answer. At least eventually. Whereas I think we really do have to be open to the fact that some of the stuff we're asking questions of because none of us really have a good answer to it. Now, you can't resolve everything. You can't, there's going to be some splits that are necessary. Go back to what I said about Mug. If Mug achieved what it wanted to achieve, it would split the DSA. I mean, I'm not saying that's good or bad. And I'm not saying that they would not be even better off for it. I don't know. Right. But what I can tell you is, given the dynamics of some of the other caucuses and the latent ties to the Democrats of a lot of the members, a formalized program would endanger that. And that's what Mug wants. Conversely, if a socialist majority caucus was to win, you would be a creature of NGO and labor bureaucracy, which would be downstream of the Democratic Party and fundamentally views its political interests only in the electoral interest of the Democratic Party and in its own bureaucratic interest. I know that's unfun, all right? And when people say we just need to organize to get around this, they have to tell you how. Organization, how and for what, is of vital importance. Just like critiquing how and for what is of vital importance. Now, again, we also know the atrocities attributed to communists are somewhat overstated, but there's a tendency to deny that any of them happened. And I'm like, you can't deny that Vietnam and Cambodia were killing each other and were both nominally MLs, or that a lot of the leadership of the various communist parties aligned to the Comintern were executed extrajudicially by Comintern members under disciplinary provisions. Those are historical facts. You can't deny them, Grober Fur is not going to get you out of those problems. Anyway. I mean, it's interesting. I've been reading a lot of debates between the CPGB Provisional Committee and Platypus, mostly Chris, from about 10 years ago. And it's very interesting how today people are like bending over their backs to prove how they have some continuity with historical communism, even though they're making up ideologies and just labeling them Marxist-Leninist, usually based on really tortured readings that would have been purged in the Yusufchina, for example, or even after. So whereas and just 10 years ago, it was the opposite. People were trying to prove how they weren't at all, had no relation to the Soviet Union, that was all bad. And it just seems to me like fundamentally to miss the point. There's this reactive nature here. Like, are you, terms that we used to use in Platypus that I think are accurate. Are you Stalinophilic or Stalinophobic? And both of which are problems. Neither of which is going to deal with the messy historical reality of the Soviet Union. And the problems that emerged with it, particularly after 1933. I mean, I date problems with it to the Bolsheviks to 1918, but at least I understand the position the Bolsheviks were in from 1918 to 1922. All right, just like I understand the situation of Chinese development in the 1950s. Like, I get why certain deviations were made. I don't know that there's a lot of choice in the matter. That's not a defense. It's also not a condemnation. It's just like a statement of fact. Our deal with is we have to deal with the primary trauma, for lack of a better word, that word's been overused, of the 20th century and the way that Marxism lost its course. And if you deny that Marxism lost its course, you have a hard time explaining what happened from 1978 forward. Does any talk honestly about the non-democratic nature of actually existent socialism without just being anti-communist? I mean, plenty of people talked about it before 2018. Part of the problem, and there were anarchists who predicted this, the anarchists weren't wrong. That when the kind of naive liberal anarchism of the Graeber generation failed, that people were going to try to repeat late boomer social democracy. And it's pretty clear that that's what happened. So this was an inner anarchist fight, believe it or not. The inner anarchists were predicting that some of the concessions made to social democracy by David Graeber would lead to people adopting, and Chomsky, etc., would lead to people adopting social democracy, which would fail, and people would naturally move to more historically radical positions like 1930s Popular Front Bolshevism. But without realizing or even acknowledging, and I think Vincent Bevins' book is like a prime example of this in a lot of ways, that led to the situation you were currently in the first place. Like this attempt to just like pick a point in history that you can go back to. You can't do that. And that's not just true for Marxists. And we're not going back to Malatesta either. Right? I'm going to give Catron the thing here. There's a point I made about activism being basically liberal anarchist today with the goal of socialism. So no ideological, electoral, even partially programmatic at first. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that was true. And I think that faction of kind of old guard anarchists, a lot of whom came out of the Trotskyist movement, actually. The person I'm thinking of here, it's a section of a book that I don't love, but It's called The Tyranny of Theory, and I think a lot of it is actually pretty anti-communist. But some of the predictions it makes about what was going to happen after Occupy was accurate. That you would see an attempt to go into classical social democracy, but in progressive democratic organizations that would fail, and that left populism would get in a rearguard action trying to defend itself and defend contemporary administrative states and stuff that it was trying to use in an incoherent way, because that's the primary contradiction. Remember that primary contradiction I pointed out to you here, that trying to use a capitalist state to do social welfare for workers is going to mean making concessions to the capitalist state and giving power to classes that are not fundamentally at all in the long-term interest of workers. So, yeah. And things like this, like, there were other choices that could have been made. Occupy could have gone a different way. I mean, the thing is, I get tired of counterfactuals because in some ways I see people use them to not address the reality that they're living in, right? But so reform is impossible. I mean, reform is reform. Reformation, not nudging. And what most people call today reformism isn't even reformism. It's nudging. It's piecemeal policy work. It's but yeah, I mean, reform's possible, right? But people would look at a truly reformist agenda as something radically revolutionary, and the socialist pragmatist would shit on you immediately for doing it. The question you have to ask yourself was, why did so many socialists go from whatever the fuck they were talking about in 2008, which was basically a kind of issue-based anarchism, to whatever the fuck we were talking about in 2016, which was like, I want my Fordism back and I'm going to call it socialism. And I'm going to have income. I mean, like, Bernie's economic policies were all over the place. Some of them were MMT, some of them were classical social democratic, some of them, I mean, like, and and socialist of the, and this is a point that Chris made separately from me. I mean, I think I didn't get it from him, but maybe his thinking early on led me to it. I don't know. That the new left of the 1960s, the baby boomer left, accelerated libertarian tendencies against Fordism that were a real problem. But the moment they did that, the repercussions of that scared them, and they tried to defend the very system they had been critiquing for the past 20 years. All right. So the silent generation left was very anti-Fordist. It was one of its, go back and read like The One-Dimensional Man, or even, my book I talk a lot about, The Culture of Narcissism, right? Those are critiques of Fordism, all right? Although Lash actually does point to a primary narcissism coming after the end of Fordism, because he was already talking about Fordism and the secondary narcissism identifying with the institutions, etc., was going to end. So, the Hour of Minerva shits on us at dusk or whatever. So we have to ask ourselves a question, like a real primary question. So many of our responses to neoliberalism have missed that neoliberalism has been in crisis. And I mean this in a serious sense, that it's not been able to deliver what it was able to deliver prior to 2007. And that we were in some kind of weird transitional period. But it's never like a complete break overnight. Like neoliberalism did not just break Fordism up. It relied on the same public-private partnership expansions that Fordism relied on. There is a continuity as well as a rupture, right? That creative destruction doesn't destroy everything into nothing. It breaks it and reformulates it. I mean, and I would not want us to be romantic anti-capitalists who think that we can just go back to like the 17th century or whatever. Or even the 1950s. Like, if you were to try to do 1950s industrial policy now with the kind of automation we have today, it would not lead to 1950s levels of employment. And we see that in the developing world. All right. Varn, do an episode on Jacoby's last intellectuals. More leftist intellectuals exist than ever. Understanding intellectuals. I did a book review on Jacoby's last intellectuals. I actually like Jacoby's last intellectuals, but I thought, interestingly, the problems that Jacoby sees of the 1960s to 1990s don't exist now. We're in a completely different media environment. But it's interesting to read that book to see how it might have happened. Yeah, Katron says, you got that from me. From anti to pro-socialist welfare state, Lash was what Adolf Reed told me to read before Platypus was recommended. Yeah, but Chris, I probably got it from you. I'm not going to deny that. I don't think I just got it from you, though, because I was also reading Lash before I even knew about Platypus. In fact, Lash is one of the things that led me to you. Even though Lash was not really something that I heard a lot of discussions about in Platypus, it was my love of Lash and Adorno. But I do think I can't deny that, like, your way of thinking had an influence on me seeing that. Absolutely. Even if it's pushing against you, like you had an influence. I don't think there's any way to deny that. Which is why I think it's funny when people think that, like, I'm somehow an enemy of Platypus Affiliated Society. Like I said in the beginning, if I actually think someone's an enemy, I don't mention them. Like, I'm not going to do public response episodes to enemies, to like real enemies, substantive enemies. This is a disagreement, and I'm not even always sure we're that in disagreement. I mean, that's one of the funny things. I think what I consider today is, like, how do we build an independent socialist movement and break people off from their dependency on popular front thinking? And, you know, there are times where maybe popular fronts are justified. I'm not sure if I think they ever are in developed capitalist societies, but when you are in a place that has not gone through industrial development, then yeah, maybe. You know, but for us today, particularly in America, given that there's no parliamentary independence in these fronts, you're subsuming yourself into a party. I mean, when people try to argue with me that, like, the Democrats are somehow a workers' party, that's like a historical ignorance par excellence. If anything, the workers' movement until the 1930s was independent, or in early periods related to the populace, but the populist mass base was mostly sharecroppers. So when the sharecroppers went away, Williams Jennings Bryan kind of pulled the first Popular Front stunt before the Stalinists came up with it in France and Italy. All right. So Pablo's case is Derek, if I'm interested in Catron's statements about a new socialist project idea, go to Catron's blog. Will do. I'll add that to my list of things I need to read before I have him on the show. By the way, for those of you who don't think that I take this seriously and this idea of critique, is the Popular Front synonymous with multi-tendency? No. The Popular Front is synonymous with supporting explicit bourgeois parties for their progressive nature in capitalism against regressive capitalist and fascist, etc. It was adopted in the context of World War II after the third period, which was the opposite, where the Soviet Union basically took the same position as the Bordigist, which said the only acceptable united front was the united front from below, even with other nominally socialist parties. I'm still kind of a believer in the united front from the below, and I am okay with united fronts in parliamentary context with socialist groups. I am not okay with subordinating ourselves to capitalist parties. I consider it a form of tailism, and I consider it to be the primary tactical and strategic error of socialists to adopt what was at best concessions to wartime survival as permanent parties because they led to temporary and very temporary blips in membership. If you look at the explosion of memberships in the Italian, French, and even the US communist parties during the Popular Front period, you will notice that they started declining before even the Red Scare started hitting them. And the Red Scare accelerated those declines in the United States dramatically. But you see like a fall in the number of socialists in the CPUSA, for example, from a high point of, I believe, between 70 and 80,000. I've seen different numbers, to about 10,000 by the 1950s. In a very brief period of time. And while the Red Scare started at state level before the national, a lot of this started as soon as they hit the high point. But by the time the war was over and you started seeing pivoting against the Soviet Union, you started losing a ton of new members. And the members were largely latecomers because there had also been dips in Communist Party membership in the past. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact took a real hit to Communist Party membership because it seemed like opposition to fascism was one of the things that the CPUSA was known for in the 1930s. They took it seriously where other parties did not. And then when you have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it's very hard to argue that that's true. What are your thoughts on a wet t-shirt contest? I think it's a good tactic for contest. I just don't care. People should have fun. I'm kind of sick of joyless socialists, my friends. As a person who also will tell you that I don't think happiness is the most important thing in life, joylessness is just a bummer. If your truth is unfuckable, then it's not going to be around for very long. That's not my thought. The thing is, there does have to be a programmatic minimum for what you're going to accept and what you're not. And that's something that we need to really deal with. When Khrushchev visited the UK, he told the Labour Party gathering that the USSR did only real fighting against Nazis or some such. The response, we lost 100,000 men when you were allied to them. Ouch. The problem when you get episodes of gaming materialist, you may know, I sold my D&D collection. I just don't like that game anymore. I still play some role-playing games. What do I got? Old School Essentials. I still like Pathfinder because I'm a 3.5 junkie. Forbidden Lands, that sort of thing. Dungeon Crawl Classics. But yeah. Anyway. I don't play miniature games because they're too expensive. I don't have time for that hobby. And yeah, played Baldur's Gate. I've watched that. I stopped playing video games around the time of Baldur's Gate 2. I'm the wrong person to ask for pop culture stuff, man. I listen to obscure music. I do read comics sometimes, but I think too much of that is intellectual sugar. I prefer my gaming to be old school. Although not the problem is, like, when you go to old school gamers, man, there's a lot of weird cultural hobby horses. So yeah. What do I like to listen to? That's a weird question. Let's see. What have I been listening to lately? I'll just look up stuff. This is one of the weird things about doing these streams is you get very strange. Recently, Anna von Holzwolf of Wolf, Akron family, which is a let's see. The new Pedro the Lion album, Alistair Robert, Low, a lot of mid-aughts hip-hop like Aesop Rock, not Aesop Rocky, different guy. Why, the books. Someone thanked me for doing. They commissioned me to do an episode of Socialism for Realists, like in 2020 or something, and I finally got to it 4 years later. I like Woven Hand a lot. I like Heaven's Gate, the movie, a lot too. For those of you who listen to the Patreon, the last thing about the shows, I really do need to cover the shows. We're one of the start shows. Excavations coming back. Behind the Patreon wall, there's Diving into the Wreckage, and I think we're going to be talking about the independent labor clubs. And Parallax Vlog, and I think finally G and I are going to cover movies because we've been talking about contemporary politics in a very punditry way lately. Yeah. Someone asked me, how do you feel about the last few Pedro Roline releases? I haven't been able to get into his period pieces. I think that musically they're okay. I mean, it's a continuity of David Barzan's solo work, but it is very introspective to his childhood. And like, I'm roughly the same age, so it's probably a little bit more accessible to me, but I imagine younger people are probably alienated by it. Any recommendations on the books about Palestine, Israel? That's not Israel. Rashida Khalid, not Rashida, Rashid Khalidi. Man, I butchered that name. Sorry, I don't even know how to say that name. I mean, there's Ian Pepe, there's Norman Finkelstein, there's a Normal Bucks. maybe get you a good history of the Ottoman Empire. Because I do think the Ottoman context for what led to the British context for the Balfour Declaration is understood, like pretty deeply understood. And yeah, read Said, obviously. Iron Wall by Shalem is pretty good. Yeah. Let me ask you, how do you see for shenanigans AI leading? I'm of the similar. I do not think that one. It's not large language models are not general artificial intelligence. It's specific artificial intelligence. If it's that, I'm not sure it's that, because it doesn't learn like a person. I find the dead internet theory to be accurate. Do you think that it would continue to a zombie corpse? There's any prospects? Well, it's not making any money, and it's highly energy intensive and thus cost intensive. If its usefulness at automating certain kinds of simple writing and stuff were more leaned upon, it would be useful. But it's not particularly useful at actually answering deep questions at all, and it doesn't seem to come up with anything new. It hallucinates, and even talking about it as hallucinations. To pick up a point from Ed Zintron, is kind of misleading. It's actually probably something closer to it's designed to bullshit. But I mean, I use it for certain things, but it's hyper power intensive, and it's so far not profitable. It doesn't actually get rid of jobs. It makes them more efficient. You'd think that get rid of jobs, but not necessarily, because some of the efficiency still requires human eyes to fix. See the CrowdStrike failure of code. It's a basic coding mistake. So yeah. I don't think that it's a useless technology, but the way it's currently being employed, not great. Not great. And I think there's a lot of educators who want to use it to basically push school kids through the system more, and call it, oh, they're learning how to do skills. But, without a ton of context and memorization, you actually can't correct the mistakes made by the LLMs, which also means that you can't really use it correctly. And it shows up. I grade a lot of stuff turned into me that's made by LLMs. I grade it. I don't grade it for, I fail it for plagiarism often too, but I don't do that first. I often grade it for what it would have done on the rubric, and it usually gets a D or worse. It can do a lot of like very basic rote writing, but if that's what you're having your kids do, or as your primary way of educating them, you're failing them anyway. Labor theory of value would tend to predict that LMs won't turn a profit and result in capital destruction. I mean, right now it's leading to a lot of probably fictitious capital investment. And what I mean by fictitious, in that when people go to valorize their investment, it's not going to be there. And it does have bad effects all over the social ecosystem. It also has bad effects, like it eats a ton of power. And this is something that Lee Phillips and I don't hate Lee at all. I mean, Lee's a friend of mine, actually. But we disagree on a lot. And one of the things is he's more optimistic about this than I am. I do think this is essentially a waste of power. I'm not saying that the LLM technology is useless to pursue, but without some real innovations, and some reprogramming to give it real, like, things like efficiency limits and stuff, it's going to be a nightmare. LMs are overhyped, but they are basically the only real innovation at Silicon Valley in over a decade. Yes, the last real innovation that was profitable was probably this guy. Will China be more productive with AI? I don't know. Probably not. They're probably not going to invest in much in it because they can see the limitations. If they invest in it in a limited way, then maybe. But as long as there's over anxious venture capital trying to get higher profits than the market will allow for in traditional means, then you're going to have all kinds of this kind of shit pop up. Listening to Varn makes my latent desire to be an educator wake up. I don't need more problems. Hey, look, I had a student ask me once if I had kids, which I don't. Yeah, LLM has some great potential, but tragically misapplied, similar to blockchain. Yeah, agreed. Anyway, anyway, to go back to my story, I told my colleagues that if a kid of mine went to college and told me they were going to college to become a teacher, that I would strongly have to resist the urge to disown them. Not because I think education is super important, actually, but I have a very jaundiced view of even progressive education in public institutions at this point. And I also, if you're familiar with hallucinations or phantoms in the phenomenological sense, do you imagine LLM hallucination as potentially analogous to that? I don't know if they're that conscious. I just don't know. And I like if you design a technology to cheat a test, let's say the Turing test, does the Turing test actually indicate what you think it indicates? It's hard to say, right? The Turing test is one data point. Does it hold conversation in a way that's consistently human? And right now, LLMs actually do superficially for brief periods of time, but don't in the long run. You can start telling they're not human pretty quickly. A simple LLM interaction uses about as much energy as an hour of an LED light bulb. Yeah, a simple one. But the complex ones needed for what's predicted to be used by Silicon Valley requires, by their own estimates, a doubling of the power grid that we currently have. Also, yeah, there's a whole lot of behavioralist assumptions and a lot of this stuff. It's actually one of the reasons why I became less sanguine on cybernetics, even though I do think social cybernetics does give you a good way to like start viewing how to deal with planning issues and whatnot, is that it has behavioralist assumptions about cognition. And I just don't think they're true. So I hear kids can't think, read. Our education system has some issues. Kids can't write very well and they read less. They do not have the executive function to read long things. And a lot of the smartest kids I have will complain that my videos are too long because they are longer than 3 minutes. I got told that my 15-minute videos were way too long. However, I think we have to view this in terms of intelligence trade-offs. It's just sort of trade-offs worth it. Like the cognitive capacity of humans is relatively stable. Yeah, you have things like the Flynn effect and whatnot, but even that's within the realm of a standard deviation. And also isn't true anymore. We haven't seen the Flynn effect in effect in the developed world, I think, since 2007. But nonetheless, and for those of you who don't know what that is, that was the idea that every generation actually showed a half a standard deviation higher on the IQ test than prior generations. Probably says a bunch about the design of the IQ test. But what it did indicate is IQ wasn't totally genetic. Even if you don't accept IQ, it's interesting that the idea of purely genetic IQ seems to be somewhat problematized by the Flynn effect. But what we have seen recently is there's a limit to the Flynn effect, and we hit it probably around 2007. And around 2015, and at least in the US, the UK, and France, we started seeing declines in general literacy for the first time amongst people around the age of 14. And after COVID, we started seeing them in people around the age of fourth grade. The idea that it's just explainable by COVID is like trying to explain crime rates through lead poisoning. There's some superficial reasons to believe that that's true, but the evidence is really not that strong. A lot of people tried to blame lead poisoning, which should have been blamed on deindustrialization. Which is to say that intellectually, a lot of these people are smart, but the trade-offs of what they're using that intelligence on is kind of damning. And furthermore, a lot of the education really is kind of bad. Like the amount that people focus on being socially consciousness, even in basic things like composition classes or basic math, is weird. Because it doesn't lead people to being socially conscious. It leads people to being ideologically conscious. Social consciousness is more variable than making sure people have a set of ideological prepositions. And yes, declines in literacy and life expectancy in developed countries is why I think why we need a theory of regression and decadence. Absolutely. And I don't think we need a theory that like just picks a time where it was better in the 50s or whatever, and we go back to that. I think we have to look at long, over complex systems. And this is something that I don't get from Marx. I get it from Tainter, and maybe, you know, that makes me eclectic, but I think it's actually something we do have to seriously look at. I haven't thought about David Rannicott in a while. I will read that Fear of Breakdown too. It's worth reading the original paper about the Turing test, where he's very clear that it is not supposed to be a test of intelligence. Yeah, I know. People misunderstand Turing. I'm well aware of that. Just like a lot of people misunderstand cybernetic theory. Didn't Veblen have a theory about conspicuous consumption and whatnot? Yes, Veblen did have a theory about conspicuous consumption and status competition. Marx talks about status competition within a class a little bit in the early philosophical and economic manuscripts. And so when people say, oh, Marx doesn't deal with that, he actually kind of does. The alienation from worker and bourgeois from bourgeois because of competition is something Marx actually does talk about. And that's not, and when we say it's dialectic, that's not good or bad. There's a lot going on. Someone acknowledge you, senpai. I acknowledge you. What am I acknowledging you about? Let me go up and find so many fucking comments. I don't see what I should be acknowledging here. Are you familiar with speculative non-Buddhism website? Yes. I don't know that much about non-philosophy. Eclecticism is good. Bullshit's not enough. Your willingness to engage in current world and your theory beyond punditry is a big part of what drew me to your channel. I'm a popular guy, Bart. Am I popular? I don't know. I only have 1,000 followers on Twitter. Actually, I also nuked my Twitter when I had like 7,000 followers or something like that, because I kind of started hating my followers. I don't like sycophants very much. I don't like sycophants very much. And in fact, actually, that's a problem with guru forms. And not to say that like there's not a need for clear leaders and clear articulators, but one of the problems with guru forms is that they often can't. They don't create the people who can replace the guru. There's too much dependency on one thinker, and that's not great. Do you have thoughts or discussions relating to Heinrich and the monetary theory of value? I think Heinrich knows Marx's theory of value and is making that up to be more consistent with modern economics. I know that's an unpopular position, and that is reading someone's intention, so I probably shouldn't do that. I used to get annoyed with Andrew Kleiman doing that, but I know that Heinrich knows Marx inside and out, and it makes some of his, debates with Fred Mosley. Mosley is right on some of what he sees as problematic in the Heinrich theory, which means that I think that Heinrich knows that he's doing some fixing. But I don't know that. Can kids sit through a 2-hour movie these days? Yeah, they can. But they'll complain about it. I teach a film class. One of the things I do is I teach a film class. I don't go into my day job a lot, but I teach a film class to talk about film literacy, interpreting visual images, stuff like that. You know, history of film, the development of filmic industries. And I talk about one of the things I talk about is why kids today have problems watching older movies. Not because they can't sit still for 2 hours and watch a 2-hour movie. They can perfectly well do that. It's that the length of the cuts and stuff are different. So you have to look at that, right, when you're looking at executive function. So yeah, they can, but they have to be pretty highly motivated. And I would say one thing that you can. Have you seen any film, Gris? No. One thing that I would say about that is that one thing you have to look about is like I think we have to do a dopamine addiction in young people today. Is Criterion worth it? The Criterion Collection channel. The channel's probably where. I mean, I collect them because I'm a big old fucking nerd. But sometimes. I was subscribed to this Criterion channel for years. I have recently cut it out because I have to pay more stuff and I needed something to cut out. Because there's just too much material for me to watch, and I only watch like a couple of films a week. And I used to be a nomad too. I'm totally with you. I'm not anymore. You can see that because my office is full of books. I've made a big deal of this. When people think that I shoot from like my basement, or I'm actually shooting from my work office, which is in the Tower of Solitude, which I like to call it, which is an isolated place in my house, kind of in an attic, so that my dog and stuff doesn't interrupt the show. And my dog can't get up the stairs. He's a cute little basset hound, and my stairs are not to code. So yeah. I've given you too much personal information. And on that note, I'm going to end. So just to recap what I wanted to announce about the show. 1, less shows a week. 2, Boundless and Bottomless and Excavations coming back, but it's going to be with a panel of people, and we're starting off talking about Bataille, because I just find Bataille fucking bizarre. The interview show is going to continue. There's going to be a lot of mixture of me trying to get new people and old people back on the show. People that I do long critiques on or engagements on radical engagements have a standing invitation to on the show. So if I cover you on radical engagements, it is only fair to give you right a response and to give you a proper interview. So that's always available to anyone who wants that, which is why I don't cover certain things. One thing I would say about the interviews is the interviews are pre-recorded. So why would I throw it? I mean, look, I've said this before about Chris. The tendency to want to throw down gives him a polemical advantage, whereas I actually think engaging with him, you're going to learn something. You know, there's drama between me and Douglas Lane because I used to work for Douglas Lane and we were friends. And we still are friends. I respect Doug in some ways, even though I politically often think he's too caught up in discourses and responding too much to immediate discourses. And I understand why you have to do that as a media figure. I think it's a disaster for thinking. But yeah, Crotrone's welcome on my show. Like I said, if I consider someone an enemy, I don't platform them. Anyway, so radical engagement's continuing. I need to work on some Bordiga writing, which I need to do tonight. I've been traveling. I've had internet problems too, which is a sore mouth. Sora Mao. I've thought about getting Sora Mao on. I kind of wanted to get him on. I have connections to him. I'm not sure that I love that book. I'm gonna have to really sit with it with mute composing some more. I feel like it lets it tends to treat aggregate forces as if there's never any personalities behind them. Anyway, but yeah, so there'll be all kinds of people coming on the show, including a lot of people you never heard of, because I like to talk to people about things I find interesting, and since I don't need this to make my living, I don't fucking care. And I do care about what my patrons think, but even there's a limit to that. So I hope that you guys follow me. So just to recap: Excavations is coming back, Balance the Bottom is coming back, Radical Engagement's less time, one live stream a month. I will do one live stream a month. That's a concession to you guys because they do well. And the shows are, the interview shows will always be on Tuesday. The reading shows are on Thursdays when I don't appear on some other thing that I'm co-streaming here. So if I'm not on Ben Burgess or on TIR. Yeah. And I'm going to go write my book now. So have a great day. Bye.